So I think we should be live about now. Okay, let's say we are live. I hope we are live now. Okay, and my AC just went on, so we should be live. Okay, guys, so I'm very excited. Seth from Hub City Vintage joined us. So thank you, Seth. I'm
You're
very
welcome.
excited about this. I'm pumped up about this live stream, and we have very interesting, very cool topic. So Seth can do. Pretty much anything about Seikos, but we are talking about military Seiko. So Seiko has a very rich rich history. Yeah, I'm gonna stop talking.
I thought we would I would touch on kind of just the whole, Seiko military history, but obviously there's of course a few that get everybody a little more excited than others, and so we'll kind of spend a little more time on those. But I did see, so you're wearing a military Seiko today, right?
Yes, so I'm wearing my one and only RAF Gen 1.
78287120, right?
Yes, that's the one.
RAF
Yeah.
pilot. I love that watch. I love that movement too. Everything about that watch is about perfect. Just a great piece. And the RAF, they've kind of got a storied history with Seiko too. They've for since the 80s they've used Seikos for their RAF pilots and their field watches all the way through to Pulsars. Today they still have those G10 watches. And so anyway, if we go back to sort of like oh yeah, that's a great shot. I love that case. I love the finish. It's just very muted. I like that watch all the way around. And of course, you have to sort of wear it on a NATO or a single pass because it's got the fixed bars.
Yeah. So this one is actually one of the straps that RAF Gen 1 was issued on. There is another one that more people know about, this brown Bund strap, but I actually got this strap from somebody who worked for MOD, and that's actually he was issued a RAF Gen 1 actually on this OC. It's like, it's real. He was using it in the line of work, and
yeah, lots of sizing changes, wearing it over over a sleeve, putting it back.
Yeah.
That looks better with all that wear. That bent keeper there, that's nice. That's a nice touch.
Yeah, I love it.
So we'll go ahead and dive in. I mean, so like all the way back to going to like 1913, right? Like sort of the Meiji Restoration. They were in full swing. Japan is like into their industrial revolution, like pretty hardcore. Things are. There's a lot of growth and a lot of industry, and Seiko was a huge part of that. And of course, their first wristwatch, the Laurel, was a wristlet that was basically made for Japanese imperial officers. That was one of sort of the first military watches, and
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and here I've got. So it would look something like this one. I'll show you here. So this is, and they were, this is a small watch. I'll flip it around for you, so you can see. So it's a small,
nice,
like a white porcelain dial, and you can see it almost has a similarity to the SARB watches of today. Just a very legible, very clear, and easy to read. And blued hands, a sub-second there, large crown, and sort of this is actually a stainless steel case on this one. But that would have been sort of the, and we'll get back around there. That would have been what the officers would have worn. And, the Laurel watches would have been sort of the name that you see on there. And then, of course, by 1938, World War II getting close, Seiko's producing like 1.3 million watches a year. And of course, they were the first Japanese wristwatch, the Laurel. And of course, that's where military contracts were obviously going to be given to Seiko. And they produced tons of watches for the military in each branch. And a lot of those early military watches look like the one I just showed you. They have variations in the dial. There's a little bit more detailing in the numerals, but most of them have an insignia, as well as the Seiko branding of either a star for the ground forces that would be just under the 12, or an anchor for their naval forces, and they used a cherry blossom for
I think I've seen some. Forces. Yeah, I've seen some.
And you may have seen them even under like the nation branding or things like that. There's a couple of other names that they used back then, but those were used throughout World War II. And of course, they would have been, they weren't very expensive watches. They didn't use a lot of stainless steel. There was a lot of base metal. Obviously, steel would have gone into their war effort, so it would have been especially in Japan, kind of a rarity. It was would have been like a precious metal. But I think probably the most, the rarest and kind of the most sought after World War II Seiko military watch would obviously be the Tensoku. Have you ever heard of that one?
No, is this the one they call kamikaze watch? Or?
Yes, that's a kamikaze.
Oh, okay.
So
which is absolutely incorrect name. That wasn't.
It is, kamikaze. Of course. That people say that because I think it was obviously for pilots, and it had a rotating bezel on the inside. It had a large onion crown. I mean, this watch was basically like a pocket watch on a strap. Not a lot of pilots even wore them as wristwatches. Most of them hung them around their neck.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
But would have been very easy to use. A large watch with a large onion crown that you could have, set with gloves on, because obviously, those planes, it would have been very cold. You probably wouldn't want to take your gloves off too often. But yeah, just to set it straight. So, kamikaze pilots, they went up with very little, as little uniform as they could get away with. That they stripped, lots of instruments out of the plane. They wanted to just get rid of the weight so that they could add munitions. Yeah. And obviously they would probably not have sent them with, watches or anything like that. Especially not one that would have been geared more towards the pilot who could use this item that would have been considered critical for missions.
Did you happen to own one of those watches?
Oh, no, they're very rare. So I think something like, so there would have been, obviously, if they did survive, they probably would have stayed, mostly in Japan. But those that may have gone down, obviously they would not be recovered, and they were worn hard. I mean, these weren't watches that were probably going to last a long time, but they do exist. But I mean, you're talking about, I've seen people ask well into five figures for them, $20,000, $30,000. I mean, for something in nice shape. They are very difficult to come by. I've never seen one even in person. So just
and I guess they have very attractive watches. So that's also
it's a nice black dial. Of course, it's got the radium at 12, 3, 6, and 9. And there's some red and black coloring in the dial. A beautiful watch. And that it's so large. I think it would have been, today it would make sense even. Even still a large watch by today's standards. But yeah, I wish I could have one. I would love to even just get to tear one down and take a look at it. I think they use a 19 linea movement in there, and then later something even a little smaller. But again, I'm sure that they're out there, and if there's any of you guys out there who are watching, if you happen to have a Tensoku or kamikaze, watch,
let us know, guys.
Here's some pictures. I'd love to see it. But obviously, so after World War II, Japan really, they're with, they sort of really became westernized, and we obviously had bases there in Okinawa, and that sort of takes us into the bigger watches that we'll talk about today, which are obviously the MACV SOG is that's really sort of an attainable grail watch for a lot of people. I'm wearing one of those too, just to show you. On the wrist, you can see it's sort of upside down.
Nice.
And of course, a classic military watch. This one's not mine, actually. So for our stream today, I borrowed some. I'm going to shout out my buddy Dan. I know he's watching. He has an incredible collection, and this is really. We'll get a closer look before we finish. I'll let you see these up close. He has some.
Is this the one that you made the videos about?
No, so we'll get to that one too, because
we'll get to. Okay, awesome.
We'll start a little bit earlier. So. You've heard of the MACV SOG watches, and I think one of the reasons that they're sort of so highly sought after is because they have such a great story. And when you think of a military watch, just like the one you're wearing, if you flip it over, you can see the NATO number on the back. You can see the serial number. It is designated. It's got the broad arrow there. You're looking at a military watch. And with
I'm gonna show it just in a second, but yeah, I'm not. Let me not interrupt you. So,
yeah,
and also, I want to mention, so kind of like the average consumer who reads Hodinkee, he heard nothing about MACV watches. So like the fact that I know about them and few people, I'm sure a lot of people who watch my channel, they know about McVie watches, but like the average collector does not. So those are, please tell the whole story. And yeah, this one is not McVie, it's just British military, like NATO number and stuff.
Right. So,
I
and like
hope you.
in America, we would have done the same thing. Like at this time, Elgin and Hamilton, Benrus, the typical military watches that you think about when you think of World War I era, Bulivas and World War II, and even through the Vietnam conflict, there were other U.S. issue watches, and they were stated as such. You could see the issue number on the watch and what purpose it was for. But for this in particular watch, so this would have been MACV SOG. We're talking about, that stands for, it's MAC-V SOG, and that's Military Assistance Command in Vietnam. And of course, the SOG, that stands for Studies and Observations Group, which is also kind of a misnomer. That's sort of a throw-off kind of name. It was a special forces group of the most elite soldiers that we had. I mean, from multiple branches of the military, including, like, I think mostly Green Berets, but you had Marine Force, Recon, you had Navy SEALs. I mean, these were the best people, Rangers. They were the best people that we had out there. And these were the guys who were crossing lines and maybe going into areas where they possibly shouldn't be. These are people who needed to have plausible deniability about the missions that they were a part of. And they did things like reconnaissance, even things like sabotage. Here we go. Chronographs used in the Second World War to measure time between muzzle flash and the sound. Oh, that was a good comment. I wish I could go back and see the whole thing. But they also did some direct action, and they were operating missions in North Vietnam, South Vietnam, through Cambodia and Laos. These are, when you think about special forces and black ops, these are the guys that you think about from the Vietnam era. And so Ben Baker, who was the head of CISO, that's the Counterinsurgency Support Office, he was kind of the guy who was tasked with outfitting these guys with any and all equipment that they might need. And part of that, a qualifier for that equipment, is that it had to be sterile. It couldn't be attributable to U.S. Military forces. It had to not have the same thing that on the back of your watch and on the back of, when you think of military watches, these are things that just had to be a watch. But obviously, military buys military-looking watches because they suit military needs. And
not like that.
Right. And I think part of the reason that we ended up with Seiko for these guys is because Ben Baker was stationed in Okinawa. He was there in Japan. And so I'm sure that it was very easy to, get his hands on Seiko. And really, I mean, we're talking about Seiko in North America really didn't even exist until, 1970 is when I think they set up shop in Mahwah, New Jersey. So Seiko was not like a household name in America at that time. We didn't, they weren't as ubiquitous as they are now. But these watches, I'll flip the camera back around and we'll take a look.
These are so cool.
So I've got a few different styles here that we'll take a look at. Let me just get this one off my wrist. And we'll just start at the beginning. So this is the 6619 8060. And you can see it's a Sportsmatic model. And you can see that it carries the 5 badge there. And for Seiko 5 is kind of it means that a watch has 5 qualifiers that make it part of a subset of watches that Seiko calls that Seiko 5 subgroup. And they are, the 5 qualities are: it has to be an automatic movement, it has to have a shared day and date window, a recessed crown, typically recessed at 4 o'clock, and it also has to have a robust case, typically stainless steel, but also they're not always stainless steel, as we'll see in just a second.
But basically, you're a very good civilian watch, right?
Right. This is going to be an everyman's watch, a watch you can wear every day without any worry about what, it's going to hold up, and it's going to be a watch you can have for years. Clearly, it works. This watch specifically, we can look at the serial number and get a date here. This one is from, if you guys don't know, if you can tell the here, I'm just gonna loop it. I can't see it. There we go. So this is a 7/8 serial, which puts it to 1967 and August of that year. If you for Seiko serial numbers, it's pretty easy to discern when it was made, because the first number is going to give you the year within a decade. So you have to have some familiarity with what calibers were made in what years, and that second number is always going to be the month within that year that the watch was produced, and the rest will just be production numbers. So we're looking at 1967. This would have been the earliest of those issued watches. And the SOG operatives would have received a watch. A lot of them, as soon as they came in country, they looked exactly like this, and they obviously did well for them. You can see this is tritium on these luminous markers, and I have heard stories of those guys that they were sometimes they were scared to wear them on the upper side of their wrist. They would, obviously, the first thing they did was take them off these bracelets, and they would be on like a NATO style strap or some sort of pass-through leather strap, usually black or OD green. And that way, you didn't have these reflective surfaces sort of giving away your position when you're wearing your watch. And a lot of them would wear them on the inside of their wrist, like I'm sure you've probably your dad or granddad. I'm sure you know someone who wore watches like that. It was kind of the fashion for a long time. And if they did wear them on the top, a lot of times they would cover them with a piece of tape, because they would glow so bright. In those dark nights, it would be visible for quite a distance. But this was the first watch.
So Seth, can I ask you a question about this one? So was it both civilian and they just used it for military, or that Seiko? Yep. Okay, so at both purposes. Okay,
that's right.
And how do you know if that watch is actually civilian or it was issued to somebody, or you don't know?
You don't know.
Yeah. You don't know. Got it.
It was a fairly available watch. In fact, if you were a serviceman and you weren't issued one, you could purchase one at PX or BX. You could probably get your hands on one pretty easily. And in fact, I heard a story that a lot of those guys, they were a little disappointed, because they all wanted to have Rolex Submariners or something along those lines. They all wanted Rolex, and Ben Baker, he says, what, I'm gonna buy 12 Rolexes for each of these teams? I don't think so, because a watch like this would have been $6 to $8. And you're talking about, think about where these guys were. I mean, we're in the in the Asian jungle. It's going to be hot and wet all the time. I mean, your watch is going to go through a lot, and it needs to be easily replaceable as well. But that was the first watch. And then
also that Rolex will raise some questions if you are captured.
Well, and they said, so some of them wanted to have the Rolex too, because it would have been a way to, you could have used it for bargaining.
I see.
And then this is the second iteration of that watch. Now, there was one before. So this is the 8060. There was also the 8280, what a lot of people call the pre-MacV-SOG watch. It looks a lot like this one, but has like a polished minute chapter, or maybe it's a brush minute chapter. But the minute hashes are actually on the dial, and there's just like a reflective rehaut there. And this is the sort of, when I think of the MacV-SOG watch, the 6119 8100, this one is the watch that comes to my mind first. And this, you can see that it's sort of a little bit of a calmer dial here, not as much going on. You don't have the Sportsmatic badging anymore. This is just going to be a Seiko 5. Quite a step up in this movement from the 6619 to the 6119. It's a little more streamlined, and you've got a quick set date on this one. And I think this is the semi-quick set day, not quite to the quick set till we get to the 6106C. This is a B version. But the watch you saw in my video the other day is the third version of that watch, which is the 6106 movement. And it's considered a DX model. But you can see it's very similar to that. And a lot of people, these still command quite a hefty price, because they are also, they look exactly like the other watches. And because there's not anything that sets these watches apart as military watches, because they have some attachment to that story. And obviously servicemen would have also worn these watches as well, just not our SOG operatives, as far as we know. Of course, there's.
So can I ask? So are all three of these watches, they are both civilian and they were just used for special forces, or any of them was actually like special watch that Seiko would make only for special forces? Do you
No,
know?
not necessarily. These were just procured in mass by Ben Baker and then issued to those guys. But you could buy one as well. I mean, there are plenty of everyone you get, likely, if it survived, it's going to be a civilian watch. I've had them in the past. I mean, I've had some where they've been engraved on the clasp, like a name and then the years of service. I mean, there's some pretty heavy detailing I've seen, but like I mentioned, so the 6119 that I showed you, that one's actually not even a stainless steel case. It's just a base metal case, and because of the acidity in your skin from perspiration and being in a moist, wet environment like a jungle, a lot of times the stainless steel plating would wear off, and then that acidity would eat into the brass. You can turn a lot of those watches over, and they don't look great. I mean, there's not a lot holding them together between.
But that's very typical. So I look at American military. I look at those like issued watches. I look at British or German military, these like DH, right? Most of them are actually brass plated, and they suffer from the same. Like if this watch was actually used in the military, it probably gonna suffer from all these issues that you're explaining. But if the watch is pristine, like nobody ever wore it, there's probably something wrong with that watch. That probably wasn't used by military.
But I think because of the association in the story, and because, like you said, a lot of people may not even be aware that was the case. I mean, if these guys were to be captured again, obviously a watch that has issue numbers on the back, and that's not going to give you're not going to have a hard time saying you're not an American soldier if you're wearing an American soldier's watch. So that was sort of the case. Is these weren't going to be anything that were going to give away what these guys were up to. Because, like I said, early on, studies and observations, they were doing a lot more than that. And these were guys who the teams would have been maybe 2 to 3 Americans, operatives, and then would have been attached to like 6 to 9 indigenous troops as well. And I mean, those guys would get watches too. I mean, there's watches like this probably all over the world. You can find them in Asia as well. These teams they would have all gotten the same watch as part of their kit, and so I imagine that there's probably some out there that were part of a serviceman's uniform and probably held on to them. I know that for a fact. So the other watch I was going to mention is the 7005 8030, and I don't have one of those to show you, and they are probably the hardest of the 3 to get a hold of. I've only ever had one in our history. And it was a beautiful one. And of course, Ben Baker, the guy that I mentioned, who was the CISO head, I've seen pictures of him actually with his personal 7005 8030. And, it looks about the same as those other, that deep charcoal gray, sort of a sunburst style with the 7005 has upright numerals rather than that italicized. But again, just a beautiful watch. And, a really cool story. It's nice to have something that Special Forces wore, even if you can't have one that was a particular person's watch. There wouldn't have been a ton of these guys anyway. I think those teams operated from 64 to about 1972. So we're only talking, it's just a 8-year period. Anywhere was there ever a true high beat military Seiko? A high beat? Well, so I'll tell you this. Seiko was wildly popular with enlisted men, period. Like a lot of these guys were getting a look at Seiko for the first time. And I was just reading a question from the feed. And servicemen, I mean, so many of them wore Seikos. It even became a part of our Vietnam sort of lore. Look at movies like Apocalypse Now. You had the 6105, sort of, that's become known as the Captain Willard watch because of Martin Sheen's character in that movie and him wearing that watch. But that was a wildly popular watch with Vietnam enlisted. And of course, I've read where the SOG operatives, even if they had this watch, if they needed a dive watch or something with a bezel for timing things, the 6106 8100 was a really popular watch, a very early Seiko sport diver. And of course, I've seen where lots of pilots wore the first navigator timer as well, 6117 8000. But these are watches that were not expensive at the time. They were watches that you didn't have to worry about. This is not some heirloom piece at the time. I'm saying these were tool watches serving a purpose, and they were they were tough. They were going to be able to take the abuse that they were being put to. Obviously, they're still running this many years later, and with a little care, you can keep them running just about forever. One of the nice things about Seiko being vertically integrated, there's parts and parts and parts. It's easy to keep them going.
Yeah. Like the problem is people like you are now very in high demand, so you can get them going.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Yeah, and that's one of the things I really enjoyed about getting, sort of when I first started, I kind of would just work on a little bit of everything, but it was very easy to fall in love with Seiko because they really are so well put together. And these guys, McVisog, putting their trust in these watches, there's stories all over like that. It's the Pogue, probably the watch that turns more people into Seiko enthusiasts than any other watch, was again another story just like that. I mean, this is a man who was given an Omega, Speedmaster to wear for his missions to Skylab, and he chose to take his Seiko with him, enough so that he snuck it, on the shuttle with him so that he could, wouldn't have to ask. He could ask for forgiveness later. But that's another great story and kind of just another testament to Seiko. But their early dive watches are, they really do, and these military watches, all of those watches they command quite a bit on their own anyway. I saw someone just say those Bullards, they do. They're you're not going to find one for less than $1,000 in any condition. Very, very well liked and loved, and again because they're very durable and can last. So as far as American military, that's really the only thing. These McVisog watches, being a part of that SOG operatives group, those three watches are sort of the grail of that group. But I did have the one. So we saw the video the other day, and I showed you the DX model. This is one, and we know for a fact was available at PX and VX exchanges. And this would have been sort of the natural evolution of the two watches that you already saw. We started with a 6619 movement. We moved to a 6119, and the 6106 was sort of Seiko's. This was their hard-wearing, robust, bulletproof movement. I mean, this is, if you buy a watch with a Seiko 6106 in it, it's likely you pick it up, even if it's been sitting in a drawer for years, give it a shake, and that sweep is going to take off.
But what size is it? Is it 36?
About a 38.
About 38. Okay.
It might be 36. You might be right.
Oh, actually,
I got a caliper here. We'll take a look.
Okay, guys. Now we're gonna know.
Yes, it's 36.
36. Okay. So it's pretty much your kind of Rolex Explorer 1, but from Seiko, also in that style. But actually with military history, not like.
Right. And it's a story, you get to tell. It's not one like you said, your average watch enthusiast, if they're not heavily into Seiko, they may not know about it.
They don't know. Yeah.
So, any sort of digging around, I remember, years ago finding out about this. And of course, the only reason we know about it, period, is a man named Frank Greco wrote a book called Running Recon. And it was about his time as a journalist and a photographer, I think, with SOG operatives on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And he did a great job of like cataloging some of these things that they were given. I mean, even picturing in that book, these specific watches as being a part of that group. And so I think there had been sort of rumor about that prior to that book, but he's sort of laying it out there. This is sort of the SOG Bible, I guess, of the time, as far as some of the equipment they used, which, guns and knives, cameras, and all of the crazy equipment that they got to use, especially the non-attributable. This was sort of when those things were given an identity. And Seiko, as obviously adjacent, they were given some. These guys had to tell the truth. These were the watches that we wore. It wasn't anything crazy or special. It was these Seiko 5 watches that we were given when we got in country, and they were great.
How do you know how? Again, sorry, I don't know. Maybe you want to move on, but I'm gonna ask one more question about McVie. How? So, given that those are actually civilian watches, right? How rare are they, or how common are they? Is it like, I don't know? Maybe you can compare to like 6105 or like POG. How is it?
I would say they're probably comparable. Actually, I might see 6105s come on the market more often than the 6119s and the 6619 McVisogs. Honestly, because this sort of, once this information kind of got out there, and multiple, Warren and Wound, I'm sure, has done a story on this. He's done a story on this. There's been lots of military enthusiasts. There's a lot of crossover between military guys and watch guys.
And I remember Spencer Klein made a video with like 1, 2, 3 and showed them like
right.
And yeah, that's how I learned about those. I'm like, oh my god, those
sure,
yeah.
Cool. He did a lot to sort of get that information out there too, and I think once sort of Seiko, the brand itself and vintage Seiko especially has just grown in popularity wildly over the last 5 years. I mean, I can remember being able to pretty much find, if someone asked me to get them a specific watch 5 or 6 years ago, I could, within a month, I could find exactly what they wanted, and say, yeah, we'll get that in, no problem. And now it's very difficult to find specific things, and especially things like this that are so collectible. I would say, I think I'll have in my next drop, I'll have a DX model, one of the latter civilian versions coming up. But I don't think I've had a 61 198100 in probably a year or so. And it's not for a lack of trying. I constantly stay looking for them, but they really do. They command such a premium. And of course, my goal is to find them that maybe need a little bit of help, and can get them back to their best. In fact, the last video we did, you saw, that was a watch that really, it was had quite a bit of character. I mean, it had been through quite a bit, and the person who sent it to me was dead set that I want to keep it exactly like it is. Let's just make it look as good as it can, and I love that. That's a lot of fun, is just to kind of give them new life.
So guys, at the end of this video, there will be a link to Seth's channel. So he has like part 3 video about this Mach V watch that he's talking about. It's amazing. He's like taking it apart, and like, yeah, you are missing out if you haven't seen it.
Is that a question from the thing? Do any special regulation for the pieces intended for military use? I don't think so. Seiko has, so like we said earlier, if someone asked a question about, are there any special regulations for pieces intended for military use? And for Seiko, really, if you're going to get into like regulation of the movement fine regulation, they usually say that for the higher line pieces. Something like a Seiko 5, I mean, I think even today it's got a pretty wide variance for tolerance. It's not going to be something that's going to be, I think for most military guys today, they're going to wear probably a quartz watch. If you need something that's going to be exactly, to the second, especially if you're syncing it with other people who need to be on the same time. But back then, no, I think that they were probably, if the watches were within a certain tolerance and they went out, and yeah, you're right. For most of these guys, it might not have been something they could have timed down to a specific second against a master, watch or clock or an individual. It would probably have to leave some room for leeway, but still, brand new, these watches are still keeping time within just a few seconds a day.
So like what comes to my mind, so there were these military watches made for navigators. So American military had FAB-D, Germans had this BUR, and British had Mark 11, IWC Mark 11 or JLC Mark 11. So those were regulated to chronometer standards or better, because that's basically, the navigator was like looking at his watch, and like if it's like few seconds apart, they could end up at enemy territory.
Right. Yeah. For pilots, it's a must. And I mean,
but for like a general like soldier or like special ops, like they probably like
not going to be not going to need the same type of regulation done. And I know that for again, Seiko didn't build these for military purpose. They were just they fit the bill for what Ben Baker was looking for, and so they were that's where they came from. That's how we got them. Now Seiko did obviously even during this time. So their first automatic chronographs, the 6139, we do know that there were some of those that were even produced just for their military. There was also a civilian version available. If you'd like to see what it looks like, it's a 6139 7010, but I think that's a 7012 is the model number that's on theirs. And they look exactly the same. It's sort of an Arabic dial, a single register chronograph, 60-second, 30-minute. But on the back, it has the insignia for the JASDF, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, and the JMSDF, the Maritime Self-Defense Force.
Oh, I didn't know that. So that's actually issued chronograph.
Issued chronographs from Japan.
Nice. I didn't know that.
And they are extremely rare. I mean, again, another watch I've never seen in person, just pictures of the case back. But they're incredible. Do a Google JMSDF 6139. Worth a look, and something that you might hope to find at some point. But yeah, so they obviously, if you have an island nation, Japan, obviously, and Seiko is far and away the largest watch producer, in that country. They're going to supply their forces with watches who need them. But like us, I think once we got sort of beyond Vietnam and into the 80s, here, you really didn't have to have a watch that was issued by GI issued, anymore. As long as your watch met certain requirements. If you had a preference, which a lot of guys do, you can sort of you can take in the military any watch that you want now. And I don't think that there's any reason to have a watch company make military watches specifically, because so many watches that meet those requirements are widely available. And even like NASA, I mean, I know that they used to have to wear specific watches that were tested and they knew could withstand and but I think by the late 80s, all of them were Casios, and in the early 90s the digital watches did the job just fine.
So I know that Americans were still producing this like Hamilton Bulova, these like small, these like 33.5 issued watches, but yeah, I'm sure others were used. And I also heard a lot of stories that a lot of soldiers were issued this like 33.5 military watch, and they didn't like them, and they like tossed them, and they got like 6105 from Seiko because that looked like a badass watch,
Like a bigger watch and much easier to read, much easier to see. A 33 millimeter watch kind of gets lost on your wrist, if it's a low light environment and you need to be able to see what you're looking at. And that 6105, I mean, you've seen the luminous wells, they're massive and easy to read hands. I can understand why they would be very popular with those soldiers, why they would want to wear them. And again, that's another one. And of course, I just finished up. I don't think I have it anymore. I just finished up a 6117 8000 for someone, and I think we sent it out yesterday. I'd love to be able to show you that one. But that first Navigator timer, with the 24-hour bezel on top, just a perfect tool GMT. And again, something that you could throw it on a NATO strap and get over top of your flight jacket. Would have been an easy watch to see. But once again, not military issue, but very popular with those guys for the same reason. But I think about the 80s, Seiko, I think that the Ministry of Defense there, I think they were about the last to still issue watches to their guys that are specific to their needs and whatever they might be doing. And so yeah, I know that even pretty recently, Pulsar and Seiko, there's issued watches for Ministry of Defense. But yeah, and that's about it. But an interesting story to be sure. What do you think of the 1968 King Seiko 45 8000 high beat gray dial? So
not military.
Not a military watch at all. But so I saw part of a video you were doing. I think your last video talking about grammar of design. And,
yes, with Axel.
Yeah. So yes, if you're asking for my permission or recommendation to buy a 45 8000, you should definitely get one. You're talking about watches back, so we're in 67. These are movements that weren't even allowed to compete at Neuchâtel because they really just kind of shamed the Swiss, hurt some feelings. They did a pretty much swept the top 5, 6, 7 positions in accuracy. A great watch. The 45s are just they're about a perfect movement. Of course, a great high beat. And I've had, let's see, I'll have to pull up some pictures. I think I've had 2 or 3 45s. It's been a couple of years now. But I love that gray dial too. And anything in sort of that grammar of design case architecture, you're not going to get a complaint out of me. As we said, those sort of faceted looks, flat planes, sharp angles, high polish, Sarutsu polishing. I mean, they're just beautiful watches, great watches. I wish I could get my hands on more of them.
Can I ask you to talk a little bit about British history? So you mentioned already this like Gen 1 and Gen 2s, and they became this like pulsar. I know you have a lot of experience with movements. So like what? Anyway, what would you?
Yeah, the 7828. I mean, that was and I was very much like a quartz snob for a long time, a lot of years. I didn't want anything to do with quartz. I just wanted to work on mechanical watches. I didn't really sell, and I'm sure I'm quoted somewhere saying I will never sell quartz watches. But I had so many people beg me to get in some 7828 pieces and start, offering some restorations for them, that I just was like, fine, I'm going to get one of these in and I'll just tear it down and show everybody why it's wrong. And I fell in love. I mean, they really are, they're amazing movements. And it's that way with a lot of early Seiko quartz. Now I'll tell you, as much as I love the 7828, not a huge fan of that 7227 second gen. I don't really like the 7T movements. There's, you can really tell they did a lot of sort of economy,
because there's black plastic,
economical choices. Quartz is life, baby. Somebody said. Yeah. But early Seiko quartz movements like the 7828. I mean, this is still a 15 joule movement with regulators. We're talking about 4 or 5 independent stepper motors. I mean, each component of that watch is built with fly-by-wire circuitry, direct circuitry. This is the same way that, planes are put together. I mean, they really didn't spare any expense. And if anything, they overly engineered these movements. They made them better than they needed to be. And it's the same way for like the 7548, one of my favorite watches. And I can't believe I'm saying this. One of my my all-time favorite Seiko diver is the 6309 Turtle. But the 300 meter tuna, the 7548 tuna, 7549, that is an awesome watch and an awesome movement. And of course, the follow-up on that, we had a golden ashtray a few weeks ago. I don't know if you saw that. And that's your 7C series of movements. So this is when Seiko took it sort of to the next level. We got thermocompensation. I mean, these are high torque quartz movements that are, these are as good as quartz movements get. And Seiko basically built an entire line of dive watches over the 7C46. It's still in production today. They still use it today. I mean, it's hard to improve on perfection. But yeah, the quartz watches, no complaints here. Although I really don't like the 7T movements as much because I prefer as little plastic as possible. I like there to be something there. That 7548 movement, when those first divers came out, think of like the 150 meter quartz. It looks like the Slim Turtle. It's sort of their core diver from the late 70s and early 80s. On the calendar side of those movements. I'll show you a little sneak peek. I've got something.
Oh, yes, please.
You've probably never seen before. So here's a 7548. I can guarantee you've never seen before. I'm going to be doing a video on this one too, if anybody wants to take a look. So this is a teal 7548. That's a JDM piece only. Yeah. So they had a few teal pieces in the mid 80s that are kind of hard to find, very, very difficult to get a hold of. And this, you can see, like the orange, it's sort of trimmed in yellow. The bezel is black and yellow. The hands are yellow.
Hey guys, Tiffany dial.
Dial. Very hard to find dial. I think typically it's thought that they were only available for 1 month of 1 year in all of history. But that 7548. So this movement was basically like their first really core quartz movement, and they built it on the platform of the 6309, the watch it was replacing, and all of the calendar side components are identical. I mean, this is basically a mechanical watch that's driven by a battery. Yeah, Thomas says the teal and orange 7548 are very
so I know about orange. Orange is like super cool.
Yeah,
I wasn't aware about teal.
So, yeah, it's very hard to find. In fact, I've seen even old forums posts where people, accused people of wearing refinished dials. They didn't even believe there was a teal dial because it was only a JDM watch. I'm sure you saw the kanji date on day on that one. Very hard to find. I mean, an impossible watch to find. And I've got a client who collects teal watches. He's got most of the Seiko teal pieces. I love when he sends something new that I haven't really seen very many before. But anyway, so this 7548, so this was built on the 6309 platform. And like I said, I mean, the crown, the stem, all of your calendar side components, keyless works, can swap between a mechanical and a quartz movement. They really did a good job of saying this works. As a 6309, how can we just incorporate quartz movement into that? And I even think that the battery compartment sits in the same spot that the mainspring did before, and it's nice.
Nice.
Really a very close representation of that 6309 movement. And so, yeah, if you want a quartz watch, buy early Seiko and even early Pulsar. There's your Seth tip for best bang for your buck. A Pulsar Y513 is the Hamazawa equivalent to Seiko's 7548, line 7546, 9. They're all very similar. But you can find Pulsar Y513s for like $150, and it is a stellar movement. Very nicely built watches. I'll push early Pulsar pretty hard. I love those watches.
Yeah, and those have some. So I think Hamilton sold Pulsar to Seiko.
That's right. Yeah, and they were luxury watches when they came out. I'll never forget. I think
they were made in solid gold only when they started.
What's that?
So pulsars were made in solid gold only when they started.
Solid gold, yeah. It was not a cheap watch, And then, of course, the Hamilton is the same way. The very early Hamiltons, yeah. Somebody says,
you're right. Yeah.
But yeah, so and Seiko bought it from Hamilton, as I understood it, that Pulsar was sort of going to be their sort of cutting edge Pulsar or quartz tech. That was going to be their quartz line, and very quickly they sort of went back, and Seiko, I don't think they had any idea that quartz was going to be, as your name suggests, was going to create the crisis that it did. But that, of course, that was the case, and within just a few years, I mean, quartz was everything. We're fortunate that mechanical watches survived and have rebounded to the level that they have.
Yeah, but also like what you're talking about, those good quartz movements, there is nothing wrong with them, and they are they're high quality, especially those early either quartz chronographs or those like quartz diver watches.
Again, that's 7828, and then of course with the 38 they have the day date, and there's a moon phase 7848. I mean, incredibly well built watches, very very fun to work on. They'll last forever if you take care of them, for sure. Very, very nicely built movements.
Very cool. Do we have Caitlin had a chance to see the questions? Like,
yes, she was passing them on as they
came. Okay, that's why.
But I do want to give a shout out, a quick thank you to one of my best friends, Dan. I know you're out there and watching. Thank you so much for sharing your watch with me and let me show these for this stream today. I have I said I have a DX that I'll be putting in this next drop, and I'm excited to get that one out there. But these three that I showed you today belong to one of my best collector friends, and this guy, I'm telling you what, he's got an incredible selection of watches that I wish I could share with the world. He's got so much good stuff. And he's a wealth of knowledge too. He's been at Seiko for quite a long time, a lot longer than me. But I owe him thank you.
Cool. Any other questions from chat, or are we? Do you guys have any other questions?
I have questions for you. So,
for me? Oh, sure.
Do you consider yourself a Seiko collector? Do you have a lot of Seikos?
I do have a lot of Seikos. I also have a lot of Hamiltons, but I don't consider myself specifically a Seiko collector. I just like a brand. And I try to collect vintage watches, and I'm looking at. I feel like I'm looking for things that other people are not looking at, because like everybody knows like Rolexes, for example, right? But things like Seiko has a lot of high quality watches that are still very high quality, and still they don't cost that much. And
yeah, it's
so I'm
really
just like naturally gravitating to Seiko and Hamilton, but maybe again, like doesn't have to be this. I'm just looking at many different things.
I like Hamilton as well. I had a so one of my favorite watches I ever owned. I sold it years ago to help kind of fund getting into, to buy a lot of my earlier tools. But I had, so it's such an interesting story about the 1969, of course, Project X. The race to the first automatic chronograph, and
a lot
of people don't realize that Hamilton played a pretty large role in that. Of course, with Breitling and Hoyer, and of course a small little Swiss brand known as Buren.
That was owned by Hamilton. Yeah.
All right, and so they were sort of they had built the micro rotor technology that allowed this modular chronograph, as big as it was already, to sort of be built. A way to, because you obviously didn't want to put a full size rotor on the bottom of this already stacked movement. But I had a Buren Cal 11, which was the same as the Hamilton Panda. And I had never seen one before with that Buren badging. I think they were only available over in Europe, and there weren't that many of those. But it was a beautiful watch, and I've always been a Hamilton fan. I love all of their old field watches. I have a good friend who's a Hamilton AD here in the town that I live in, so I love looking at all the stuff that they've sort of reissued. That's a big thing right now. All these vintage reissues.
Yeah. So the problem with them is that now Swatch owns them, and they used to be like very luxury brand. It was kind of like American Patek. Like if you were in United States, you want to buy yourself, like, the money is not object, you would buy Hamilton, right? But now Swatch keeps them in this like $500 up to $1,000 range, so they can't even do things like, you cannot buy solid gold Ventura, for example, right? Like that watch just screams solid gold, but they cannot make it because it needs to be cheap. And, so that's kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, it is kind of a sad thing. So I have a question somebody sent. Do all 5626 7000 have the gold KS emblem on the back? No, I don't think they do. I think later, I think the 71s, some of the later 71s don't. They might just have KS on the back, engraved in the steel, and some of them don't have. I don't think they have any sort of KS insignia on the back. But yeah, get you an early one. Get something with a medallion. Always, that's way cooler. Get a good medallion too. If anybody's curious what he's talking about, I think I've got a case back here. Oh, I'll never find it now that I'm looking for it. Yeah, so a lot of the old King Seikos, they have this sort of gold medallion on the back, and this is I believe this is a 45 case. 4502 7000 would have been a gold plate case, but yeah, wouldn't you rather have that on the back of your watch than just a little KS engraved on there? Yeah, get you an early one with a good medallion. Yeah. They're beautiful watches. Yeah, everybody loves talking about King Seiko, don't they? King and Grand Seiko. And I think it always comes up in every Seiko conversation I have, but I why not? Even I love the sort of the more recent reissues of that King Seiko, how they did a good job of sort of, it was a pretty faithful revisit of the older ones. I think there's one with like a red dial that's really, really nice. But yeah, I saw another watch I saw on your other stream was sort of those early Grand Seiko too, like I remember Seiko just a couple of years ago reissued that sort of the 3160, that the very early ones. That sort of classic case architecture still has sort of come back into fashion too. SGBW, I think that's the reference on those, but beautiful watches. Everybody out there, King Seiko, Grand Seiko, yes, do it, get it. You're not going to be upset.
Great watch. But the thing is, like, if you go vintage, they are so much cheaper, like right now. So I think the value and quality is there, but like the current market prices are so much lower, and the only problem is it's finding a person like you because the demand is so high,
and I forget that at times that it is difficult, if you if there are issues, and for a lot of those it can be difficult to find parts. But if I can give anybody any advice, if you're looking for those, always buy cosmetic first. If you're looking at a King Seiko or a Grand Seiko, you buy the nicest cosmetic example that you can, and then we can, we'll sort out some parts. Shoot me an email, and we'll get you on a list, and we'll figure it out. But yeah, I mean, we can always, parts can typically be found. Like I mentioned to Andrew earlier, Seiko, like Rolex, they're one of the only other brands out there who all of their manufacturing from top to bottom is vertically integrated. They made it all into very strict tolerances, from cases, crystals, dials, hands, stems, crowns, all of it. They made it all. And so that gave them opportunity to do a lot of interchangeability. I've got catalogs dedicated to Seiko interchangeability, and lots of different things can be used from one watch to several other watches in between years. There's lots that carries over from one movement to the next, even in updates of movements. So it's not hard to. Seiko's easy to fall in love with because you can almost keep these watches running indefinitely, because there's so much parts out there. That's the only reason I think it's one of the major reasons that this is the only thing I do, is because it takes so much room to hide all of these, keep all of these parts that I've watches and donors that I've got around for ways to keep this. I can't just call Seiko and be like, hey, I need an escape wheel for 694502. It's just not going to work. You have to just have stuff when you can find it, stockpile it, hoard it.
Yeah. So the main problem. So the popularity of Seiko is growing so fast right now. So it's especially in US. So I know that in other countries it's easier, but in US the popularity of Seiko, like any Grand Seiko, King Seiko, like any Seikos, is growing, right? And the watchmakers like you, they're in high demand. They are pretty much swamped. And you go to like a normal watchmaker who's servicing the Swiss watches, and he says, "Oh, I don't have parts," and it's So I waited for my 7002 to be serviced for 1 year.
Oh wow!
So so I waited for 1 year to come to my turn, and after that, he did amazing job. I'm not gonna share the name of the watchmaker, guys. I don't want him to be even more basic, but 1 year, another he did amazing job. The price was good, the quality was but it's like, oh my god.
Yeah. I think for a lot of guys don't necessarily want to work on vintage watches because it can be a headache if it's not something that you do all the time. I mean, I probably do, I don't know, 10 or 12 6139s or 38s a month. I mean, these are watches that just, there's very little that can be going wrong that I can't just be like, oh, well, here's the problem, without even throwing in our time grapher. You can usually just tell if there's some issue. But they take a lot of familiarity with them to be comfortable. And I know that if I didn't work on them at all, I mean, I would just be like, no, probably not going to do that. This is just something's going to be wrong, and I'm going to be stuck with this, So yeah, it's best just to find somebody who that's all they do.
Absolutely.
I think that that's a good tip for watchmakers out there, period. If you guys are, if you're going to work on vintage, find one thing and just dive head in, because I still find things that I did not know existed. I showed on a video the other day, I had no idea that Seiko made their own clasp extensions apparently in the 60s and 70s. Like if your bracelet was too short, you could buy a Seiko brand clasp extension. This is the only one of this I've ever seen in my life. It's exactly the same dimensions, but I mean, there's these tiny little details that of things that you'll learn all the time that you had no idea for, servicing stuff. And it's good to just wrap your mind around as much information as you can about one brand and stick to it. Otherwise, it can get overwhelming quickly. Yeah. Someone asked, what's my best strap suggestion for a 6105? Go to uncleseiko.com and buy Larry's, either the Captain Willard, but I put a chocolate bar strap on a 6105 recently, and I thought that looked great. But those straps he's got are absolutely hands down the best.
Do you have any experience with vintage rubber straps? Do they break a lot? Like how?
They do, and I've got a couple of secret ways. Maybe I'll share it with you after the stream. I don't want to give away all of my secrets I've gleaned over the years, but sometimes you can save a vintage rubber strap. They get brittle, they get dry. The type of composite that they were, if they sit and they don't get used a lot, they can become stiff. And of course, the first time you go to put it on, you bend it and it just creases and breaks right down the middle. But yes, some of them can be salvaged, especially straps like the GL831 Seiko's turtle straps, and even some of those earlier Willard style, that waffle style strap. Some of those can be salvaged. But just when you get them, don't try to force them out of the shape that they're in. Find a watchmaker you like and ask if they do any sort of strap conditioning. But it can be done a lot of times.
Got it. Cool. Okay, guys. So thank you so much. Thank you, Seth.
Yeah, Andrew, this was so much fun, man. I'm usually being told to stop talking about watches. I've got one audience member over here who's tired of hearing about it, so it was nice to get.
I know who that audience was. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, guys. So at the end of this video, there will be a link to Seth's channel. Please go check him out and subscribe. Encourage him to make more YouTube videos. Check out his Mac V, like part 1 to 3 on Mac V. And where else can they find you, Seth?
We're on Instagram, and of course we have our YouTube channel. We have a Patreon. Caitlin says it's at Hub City Vintage on YouTube, and you can join our Patreon if you want to see what we're getting in before anybody else. Yeah, that's it. Got our website. Sign up for our newsletter if you want to know ahead of time what's coming up. And of course, if you want to get on the waiting list for any servicing or repairs, restorations, let us know. We're happy to help.
Okay. Thank you, Seth.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.